Spanish Society Change Panel. My name is Mike Short. I'm the Chief Scientific Advisor for the Department for International Trade and indeed a trustee of the British Spanish Society. You're all very welcome to join us today and for our particular panel and discussion about around the route to COP26 and the plans for COP26 indeed in Glasgow in November 2021. Maybe I can just say from a British Spanish Society point of view, one of the reasons why we chose to do this was because it seems very appropriate that 2 years ago, COP25, the previous climate change activity, was held in Madrid, when Madrid hosted the Chilean government, actually in Madrid. And 2 years on, with a 1-year postponement, we are hosting the COP26 talks in Glasgow in the first 2 weeks in November. So in some ways, we thought the British Spanish Society should do the kind of the road to Glasgow, the changes from Madrid to Glasgow, some of the attention that's being given on things like climate change, some of the attention that's being given both to the climate science, but more appropriately to areas such as mitigation and adaptation of climate change. It's likely that we try and keep it in a relatively non-technical level because we know we've got a bright audience, but we want to please everybody with the panel discussions this time. Maybe I can introduce very briefly the 6 panelists we have who are all experts in their own field and also helping to bridge the Anglo and British and Spanish speaking peoples. I'll just briefly introduce them now and then ask them to say a few more words about what they do. So our first speaker will be Ana Barreira, who's a lawyer and director of IIDMA, and she's calling in from Madrid. We have Pilita Clark, who's a columnist for the Financial Times and an associate editor and business columnist. We have Ramiro Fernandez, who's a senior policy advisor with the UN high-level champions, and he can say more about that in a moment. Professor Jim Hall, professor in climate and environmental risks from the University of Oxford. Carlos Monreal, who's founder and CEO of Plastic Energy. And David Reavley, who is the chief executive of Solar Water. Each of them will say a bit more about what they do and their interest in this particular subject. So could I turn first to Anna, just to briefly introduce herself, and then followed by Pilita. Anna?
Yes, hello to everyone. Thank you for the invitation. And as Mike already mentioned, I'm the director and founding member of a Spanish organization called International Institute for Law and the Environment. I'm an environmental lawyer. I've been practicing environmental law in the last 28 years. And I've been involved in climate change even from the times when I was a student at London University in 1992, when the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed. It was a time when there was not internet, and my professors taught me about climate, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And I attended the first COP in the COP5 in 1999, and I've been following all the EU policy on climate change in all these years, and of course all the negotiations. And as a lawyer, there are many aspects to take care of.
Thanks, Anna. Pilita, please.
Thanks, Mike. So yes, I'm Pilita Clark. I'm, as Mike says, an associate editor at the FT and also a member of the FT's editorial board, which means that I sit in meetings at 11 o'clock each day and bat around thoughts, great thoughts and ideas. Well, not my great thoughts generally, but sit with some extremely clever people who are the brains trust of the paper. Martin Wolf, Gideon Rackman, the editor, of course, the deputy editor. And actually that's one of the reasons I'm keen to hear what everyone has to say tonight, is because as a paper, we, like all organizations really, have become much more interested and have been covering climate change much more assiduously and have been much more involved, I would say, certainly since COP25 in Madrid. But really just in the last couple of years, and even during the pandemic, the curious thing is that COVID-19 has, if anything, I think just accelerated and deepened the world's interest, the public's interest in climate change. And it's changed significantly since the last COP I went to. The first one I went to was in 2011 in Durban, when I was environment correspondent at the FT. The last one I went to was in 2016 in Marrakesh. The biggest one, of course, was COP25, where the Paris Agreement was forged. And I think the interesting thing, and a theme we may get onto tonight, is that, in a sense, even if there were no COP, the urgency and the pressure to act on climate change, I think, would be carrying on regardless. And so it means the role of the COP has really changed significantly, I would say. So I hope we can talk a little about that as the evening progresses.
I'm sure we will. Ramiro, can you introduce yourself, please?
All right, Mike, thanks a lot. As you said, I'm Senior Policy Advisor of the UN High-Level Champions of Climate Action, which currently are Gonzalo Munoz, appointed from the Chilean presidency, and Nigel Topping, appointed by the UK presidency. The role of the UN High-Level Champions decided in Paris, it is to engage and connect business, cities, investors, indigenous people, civil society to accelerate climate action, to commit to climate action, and connect it to the process under UNFCCC. I've been following the process under UNFCCC since 2008, attending almost every COP since then, and had the privilege to be senior advisor of the COP20 presidency of Peru in 2014, and partnering with the French government and the Secretary Generals under what was called in those days the Lima Paris Action Agenda on the road to Paris. So happy to talk today, as Pilita said, about which is the role of COP these days in the context of urgency and on the way forward.
Thank you. And Professor Jim Hall from Oxford University.
Hi, thank you, Mike. Hola y buenas tardes. Great to be here. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me. I'm Professor of Climate and Environmental Risks in the University of Oxford. So my focus is upon the impacts of climate change and how we adapt to those impacts. And I mean, this has been a really remarkable summer in terms of the way in which so many places around the world have been struck by climate impacts, floods in Germany, fires in Greece, droughts in the USA, and now the latest impacts of Hurricane Ida and famines in Madagascar. And so I mean, there is some sense in which adaptation has been the Cinderella of the COP process. I'll say a little bit more in a moment about the way in which I think adaptation is very rapidly coming up the agenda. But I mean, with also the publication of the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report, which was so definitive in terms of the attribution of climate change in relation to the observed changes that we're seeing, I'm seeing a sense of urgency with respect to adaptation as well as with mitigation right now.
We'll come back to that, Jim. Carlos.
Hi, thank you very much, Mike. Congratulations to the British Spanish Society for the organization of this event. I think it's very, very appropriate. And my name is Carlos Monreal. I'm the CEO and founder of Plastic Energy. I'm an engineer by training, but really a serial entrepreneur by heart. I incorporated Plastic Energy 10 years ago with the mission to find an alternative solution to the ways that we are used to recycle plastics. We have developed this type of technology. We have 2 plants operating since 5 years ago already. Are in the process of investing over 250 million euros in the development of the technology. And we have to remember that this is not only because the Chinese government reminded us back in 2018 that after they banned the importation of plastics into their country, and really made the rest of the world to wake up to try to find a solution to the way that we use plastics. But we have to remember that we continue producing more than 1 million tons of plastics every day, that less than 15% of those plastics are being recycled, with the balance is going to incineration, landfill, or leakage into the environment. And clearly, this is something that we have to stop. It's not because it will be good for the circular economy, it's also that it's not good for our planet, and we have to change it. So examples of the importance of this, we are recycling in Europe something like about 5 million tons of plastics per year. There is a goal to be able to double this number to 10 million tons by 2025. That is going to request more than 8 billion euros to be invested in Europe alone by 2025 to reach this goal. And there is really no time to waste. And from our point as a company, mainly I invite anybody to read it. We have produced, as a first mover within the industry, our first sustainability report that can be downloaded from our webpage. And I invite everyone to really go through that route, which I believe is going to be very important for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. Feel free to put the website in the chat should you wish to do so. David, would you like to say a few words of introduction?
Hello and good evening, everybody. My name is David Reavley. I have the privilege to be the Chief Executive of Solar Water PLC. As Mike said in the intro, we are a relatively new company trying to tackle a very old problem. We have a global water crisis. Global demand for fresh water will exceed supply by 40% by 2030. Climate change will shrink rainfall, snowpack, freshwater availability by 40% by 2050. We're going to look forward to a 15% global population growth. Water becomes the new oil, leading to increased water wars. So there's a crisis. We have at Solar Water a sustainable solution. No fossil fuels, no greenhouse gases, no membranes, no harmful brine, sustainable freshwater solar water, zero carbon process, cost competitive. To put it into perspective, today, never mind what happens in 2030, today, over 1 billion people on this planet have no access to fresh water. We talk about all the things we can do and could do. You can only do these things if you have water. You start the construction of something by mixing concrete with water. The workforce has to drink water. Everything starts with water. We've lived 7 millennia without electricity. I defy any member of the audience to live 7 days without water. So let's all stop talking about what we could do, and let's do what Solar Water does and actually do something about it. And later on, I will explain what we're doing across 30 countries across the world. Thank you for the opportunity. It's a pleasure and an honor.
David, thanks for the introduction. We'll certainly come back to those examples before we finish. So can we move back to Anna? Anna, given you've had long experience as an environmental lawyer, and I think I noted 1999, 22 years ago, was your first COP. Can you describe a little bit how you've seen the COPs having changed over the years and how some of the messages, perhaps in this century, are going to be more about adaptation and mitigation? Can you describe that journey a little bit, particularly from Madrid COP25 to Glasgow COP26?
Definitely, there has been big developments in this already 27 years since convention, the UNFCCC entered into force, because although COP26, it's every year, I mean, the COPs are every year, but we have to recall that last year there was no COP, but it's 27 years. So I must say that first, we must take into consideration that we are very delayed, because this convention is the result of the first IPCC assessment report published in 1990. And that assessment report already warned of all the effects that we are living today. That was in 1990, and the convention was developed in 2 years of an intergovernmental committee. And then there were all these COPs, as you mentioned, and the development has been clear. I mean, there was no targets. The convention was a framework convention. It has to be developed. And the first part of all these years, there was the negotiations for the Kyoto Protocol. And then after, how to implement the mechanisms that were agreed in the Kyoto Protocol, mainly the clean development mechanism and the joint implementation and the carbon trade mechanisms. But after, there has been more and more IPCC reports, assessment reports, warning us about that action was not enough. And to me, this is very sad, because I remember, and I must go back to my times in London when I was a student there in 1991, 1992, and I was reading this report. And I always said, how come the international community, countries, they were, and companies, because nowadays the thing has changed completely since the signature and the adoption of the Paris Agreement. There has been a big change in the last 5 years. But before, there was no interest at all in all these matters. And I can tell you, because I've been an environmental lawyer for ages. And then the developments in the last 5 years are being great. And I must say that, for example, the EU has always been a leader in climate action. I would say also the UK, because the UK is the first country that developed its own climate act in 2008. And then many countries have followed suit. And for example, our climate change law in Spain just was adopted this year. It has taken many years till we have this law. But now what is important is the implementation of the law. For example, the EU has developed many targets, and legislation to comply with those targets. For example, under the Kyoto Protocol, the EU had a commitment to reduce emissions by 2012 in 8%, and after there was a commitment to reduce emissions in 20%, including 20, because it was a commitment 20-20-20, renewables and energy efficiency. And the EU has been developing many legal instruments, mainly those years was the emissions trading scheme. And now that because of the Paris Agreement, there has been a call of action for all countries, because as you know, under the Kyoto Protocol, only developed countries, Annex 1 countries of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change had obligations to mitigate climate change. Now with the Paris Agreements, the Paris Agreement did this change, and all countries have to have their own NDCs, national determined contributions, which are for adaptation and mitigation action. And the EU has committed just recently through binding commitments in the EU climate law adopted last July to achieve in 2030 a reduction of at least 55% by 2030. And also this law includes the obligation of the European Commission to work after the global stocktake that will take place in 2023, commitments for 2040. I would say that this is thanks to the Supreme Court decision, the German Supreme Court decision, because as there has been in all these years, a lot of, particularly in the last 5 years, an explosion of climate litigation. There was this case in Germany where the German Supreme Court has called or ordered the German government to also to include in their own Climate Change Act a commitment for 2040 and to achieve after the net zero commitment or the climate neutrality in 2050. So therefore, the EU has been taking a lot of measures to comply with all the commitments adopted in COPs and legislation. And now it has come with a new package, which is Fit for 55, to comply with that commitment of reduction, mitigation of 25% by 2030, which is a very ambitious package with many new proposals, new directives, and amending existing directives and regulations. But for COP26, probably other speakers will talk about, there are very key aspects, because in Madrid, it was not possible to end the negotiations on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which deals with carbon trade mechanisms and how to change the system, or just it will be how to build the successor of the CDM and the JI. And also there is a problem still, and negotiations are ongoing on the loss and damage mechanism and with the enhanced transparency framework. So there are many aspects still to be decided in COP26. Negotiations are ongoing, and we will see what happens at the end. But and I just want to finish, and I want to stress what is fundamental, because we have many laws, and when we see climate change, we cannot only concentrate in climate change, because we live in an Earth system. The scientist community has explained us about planetary boundaries and all the interconnections among climate change, biodiversity protection, the presence of nitrogen and phosphorus in the atmosphere, novel entities, and also water scarcity. And therefore, we have a very well developed legal framework that has been developed in the last 50 years. I recall that next year it will be the 50th anniversary of the United Nations Stockholm Conference, UN Conference on Human Development. And the problem resides or is because of the lack of correct implementation or weak implementation. We have a deficit on implementation. And finally, there are very good initiatives, I would say, for example, plastic energy or innovation is also fundamental. We need also a combination and a battery of measures. Law is how society agrees and convene for a common framework, for a common aim, how to achieve it. But we need also economic incentives. We need innovation is fundamental. So I hope that this, in summary, reflects what has been happening in the last 27 years. Thank you. You are mute. You are mute, Mike.
You're mute, Mike.
Unmuted. I was just applauding your energy and enthusiasm in that great introduction. Could I just have Pilita for a few words? Clearly, the nature of COP has changed to be accepted as a much more global issue today. But to your point in your introduction about urgency, can you, Pilita, just say a few more words about how you would see the urgency being conveyed? Can you amplify that a little bit?
Yes, I mean, I'm afraid I'm quite worried about COP26. I think it's highly possible it will be a disaster in many ways. A lot of people I've been speaking to have been talking about it in terms of Copenhagen in 2009, which was a notorious COP where there were huge global expectations of action, and in the end it failed. And the reason that it failed at that time was because the US and China, the world's largest and second largest emitters, had not done enough preparatory work to come to an agreement on what could be decided at COP. And we're in we're in a worse situation now. The parallels aren't quite exact because this COP is not trying to forge another agreement that was done in 2015 in Paris. So we have the Paris Agreement. We have this, as Anna's just explained very well, we have this great global agreement where all countries in the world have now agreed they're going to do something on climate change. The trouble is they're not doing enough. And we know that because one of the little understood aspects of the COP15 meeting in Paris that forged that Paris Agreement was that they also asked the IPCC to do a special report on what 1.5 degrees of warming really looked like. And it was that report that came out in 2018 that really galvanized thinking and behavior and anger and fury, really, about the lack of progress on climate change, I think. It helped the Fridays for Future, Greta Thunberg, all of the street actions, the street protests that we've seen surging over the last couple of years come to light, because it basically said, we really need to halve emissions by 2030 and bring them down to net zero by 2050. And net zero was a concept that no one had really heard of much before 2015 or 2018, really. And now, so we've now seen this blossoming, this surge of net zero declarations and goals, or climate emergency declarations, goals to reach net zero by a certain amount. But there's an understandable anger, I think, amongst many people who just say, well, hang on, you know, we're just nowhere near bringing emissions down to the levels needed to avoid that 1.5 degrees of warming that was set out in that 2018 report. And so I think the problem for the COP is that it's going to be a sort of a tale of two COPs. On the one hand, you've got the sort of the technical, the legal responsibilities of the meeting to finish off that rule book that Anna was just talking about, to get Article 6 signed off potentially, and some other important aspects that, technical aspects about reporting greenhouse gas emissions and making sure that that's all transparent and even. But on the other hand, I think that the UK government's done a good job here by basically saying, okay, actually I think Boris Johnson, being Boris, has said, he wants the COP to be about coal, cash, cars and trees. It's a bit simplistic, but actually I think the first one of those, coal, is really important. The UK has basically said what we'd like to see, which has actually got nothing to do with the formal UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change negotiation, which is what the COP is. If we could get into some sort of agreement about phasing out coal by a certain date, I think that would be tremendously useful and important. If we could get another agreement on when the last internal combustion engine car will be sold, that would be great. If we could get agreement finally on the cash component of that, which is rich countries agreeing to mobilize more money for poorer countries to help them not just cut emissions, but adapt to climate change, that would be brilliant. And actually, it's absolutely necessary, but if that doesn't happen, it really will be disastrous. Trees, I mean, yes, that's the forgotten part of climate, the sources of climate action are forestry, land use change. Extremely important, extremely neglected in many ways. But, in a way, the expectations for this COP have moved beyond the actual technical requirements of the process, the ticking off Article 6, which it's actually incredibly difficult to do that, and it's not really clear to me that that's even going to happen. So the bar has gone up. The difficulty is we have US and China with a very fraught relationship. We've seen John Kerry and Alex Sharma going to China, trying to talk to climate representatives there just in the last week or so, coming back really not with any of much evidence of movement. So, that to me speaks to a big problem. And I'm afraid that I'm not very optimistic about what we're going to see in November.
Would you add that there is insufficient time even for major nations to get movement between now and then?
Well, yes, actually, I think so, because when I was environment correspondent, for example, in the run-up to the Paris Agreement, which looked as though it was a pretty easy deal to seal from this distance, at the time it wasn't. And the Obama administration put enormous effort into trying to figure out what was doable in terms of a deal between Washington and Beijing. And the result was the Paris Agreement, which was, a diplomatic triumph in as much as it got all countries to agree that they were going to take some climate action. Ultimately, a scientific failure in many senses, because, of course, like all of these agreements, there was there's no punishment for failing to meet that. The ratcheting up mechanism, which is jargon for basically a central aspect of the Paris Agreement, which is that everybody agrees to promise to cut emissions by a certain amount in a certain year, and then every few years, every 5 years or so, they're supposed to improve that. And this is last year actually, but this year, one of the big tests of this COP is how many countries are going to come forward with significantly improved pledges on climate action. And we just saw China, India, Saudi Arabia, several other countries miss a July 31 deadline for action on this. They were supposed to come up with improved pledges. Now everybody's saying, oh, well, it's all right, China might do it at the UN General Assembly, or maybe we'll see more action at the G7, the G20, all of these meetings. We're 2 months away from the COP, and the sort of groundwork that was done by Washington in the run-up to the 2015 Paris Agreement in December of that year, that was done in 2014. And I just think, the diplomatic footwork that goes into something like sealing an agreement, that, it's terribly easy to underestimate it. And I'm afraid there are a lot of great people in the UK who've been working very hard on this. I don't think they've had, for understandable reasons, to be fair, nobody expected a pandemic. It's amazing the COP's even going ahead. But, at the same time, I think this year, the diplomatic work that was required, unfortunately, didn't take place.
Let's not end with the difficulty. Clearly, there is urgency and there is some good work still going on. Ramiro, from your position, and I know you're calling in from Patagonia, does this headline of coal, cash, cars and trees resonate over there? Would you say that some of the progress issues aren't quite as bleak as described by Pilita?
I think they does very much. And actually, it does for many reasons. The first reason, it is, as Anna said, we have to see the COP process, the UNFCCC process, before and after Paris. We've been negotiating an agreement for more than 20 years. Paris was a turning point, and a critical turning point. Since Paris to now, the formal process in the UNFCCC has been working on the reglementation, the rule book, on all the reglementation of this agreement to be implemented. But at the same time, as Anna and Pilita said, we've seen since Paris emerging role of cities, business, investors, and other actors enhancing on climate action and addressing and having more and more commitments every year. And a few lessons, 3 critical lessons that we got from Madrid as a COP, and they went very much under the radar. But COP decision in Madrid, first, you have 195 countries recognizing that to implement and to fulfill the goals of the Paris Agreement, they need the support and role of all these, what is called non-state actors, cities, business, investors, and others. They also recognize and welcome the emergence declaration of what is what's called the Climate Ambition Alliance. The Climate Ambition Alliance is the first umbrella alliance with net zero commitments to 2050 with the broad state of actors. And the third critical achievement from Madrid was the launch of what is called 1.5 sectorial pathways under the Marrakesh Partnership. These pathways are very much the basis of the 4 key elements that Pilita was just mentioning from Boris Johnson. And this to say, if something is happening with COPs, and Glasgow should be a turning point into that, is to show how we are pivoting from a negotiating process under national governments to an implementation process that engage all actors of society. The good thing on the road from Madrid to Glasgow to recognize that it's been going underway, it is that today we have, under the Race to Zero campaign, over 5,000 entities committing to be net zero by 2030 and halving their emissions by 2030. This has over 3,000 companies, over almost 1,000 cities, regions, and almost 200 investors representing $80 trillion of assets under their own management in different areas. So this is critical, and this happens in the middle of a pandemic. This creates a lot of momentum and a lot of commitment. So I think we can see, I'm hearing a lot of background noise, sorry about that. I think we can expect to see, sorry, one more element there. We will also have, thanks Mike, that helps a lot. We will also have in the road to Glasgow, in the last year and a half, 9 of the 10 biggest economies committed to be net zero by 2050, or in the case of China, 2060 at the latest. So I fully agree. I was very much into following all the agreement between China and the US that enables the Paris Agreement, the signing of the Paris Agreement. I think we're in a different situation now, and we have all these actors committing to be net zero and committing to show progress on climate action. We will have some substantive sectorial commitments coming in on energy, on mobility, on nature-based solutions, hopefully on finance as well, but not only from national government, from all actors of society. And in many ways, the success of Glasgow, it will be related to how much we can show, how we are pivoting towards implementation, how we are going to be accelerating action in the next 5-10 years to put ourselves in track with what science is requesting to us. So I think the main challenge, I would say, and which was very much highlighted this week, the whole process of Glasgow could be deeply undermined if it is perceived as an unequal process where different people of different places in the world cannot attend Glasgow because of different type of restrictions. And if it is not an inclusive COP, it will be very, very difficult to have to keep the credibility of the outcome of the COP. But I do turning point.
Points really well made. I don't think anybody has wanted a COVID-affected COP, whether it's the pandemic itself or restrictions on travel. But I think your point about that shift towards implementation is exactly right. And I think the stepping up since Madrid of industry sectors, innovation, that has been quite notable in the last 2 years. My own particular sector, the mobile industry by background, for me, has adopted all of the UN Sustainable Development Goals in the last 5 years, all of them. And they have energy reduction plans and environmental improvement plans. And I think the same can be said for other sectors as well. So I'd like to continue though with Jim, if I can. Could Jim Hall say a few more words about this roadmap towards innovation, particularly how he sees solutions emerging in terms of mitigation and adaptation? Jim, would you like to add some more, please?
Sure, absolutely. And let me focus on this question of adaptation, which I highlighted in my few introductory words. We've heard about some difficult things already, and unfortunately, adaptation is difficult as well for a number of reasons. One is, unlike carbon, there is no metric. It's very difficult to measure how we're doing. There is no target, and what represents good adaptation to climate change is very much complex, context dependent. And it's very difficult to disentangle from development in general and disaster risk reduction in particular. And so that has proved to be a real kind of ongoing challenge in relation to adaptation finance. And lots of countries are having to jump through extraordinarily complex hoops in order to demonstrate that the steps they're taking to adapt are eligible for finance. But what is absolutely clear is that the impacts of climate extremes are a threat to development. My team and many others are working with many countries worldwide, especially small island developing states, the most vulnerable countries, where development is just being thrown off course with extreme events which are hitting increasingly frequently and severely. And that is just hitting public finances, it's diverting resources away from other activities within the public sector, it's denting investment confidence, denting the willingness to innovate and take risks. Adaptation is part of the COP and the UNFCCC process. Countries are putting forward their national adaptation plans for COP26 at the moment. And as we've heard, financial support, including for loss and damage, is part of the process as well. Things I'm seeing and will be involved in at COP involve questions around how does one prioritize that adaptation finance. So how can that be targeted at the sectors? How can it be targeted geographically within countries in order to achieve the most benefit in terms of climate risk reduction? And that is an incredibly complex question. There are lots of opportunities, however, in particular in using spatial data to begin to pinpoint ever more accurately where climate extremes might hit, where that adaptation action is needed. There are a number of really interesting things going on. One is the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, which will be at COP. Another which will be supported very strongly by Mark Carney is development of Global Resilience Index, which is helping to inform that targeting action. And another piece is around the incorporation of physical climate risks within the finance community. Many people will know about the role of the task force on climate-related financial disclosure and how that is really making a difference in financial reporting in terms of the reporting the exposure of companies to climate risks. A lot of that is focused on exposure to stranded assets, to fossil fuel assets, but part of it is to do with to what extent are companies exposed to the impacts of climate change, which is the piece that I look at. So another thing that's going to be going on at COP is the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investments, which is looking at how we should be better reporting on physical climate risks and how that can incentivize action on adaptation. There's a very long history of reporting on risks incentivizing action. We just need to look at the insurance sector and the way in which many years ago insurers were instrumental in setting up fire departments, the way in which in your own insurance policy you can have some deduction to the cost if you're taking reasonable risks to reasonable steps to reduce the risk, for example, of your house getting broken into. So this isn't new in the finance sector, but it is new in relation to physical climate risks, and this is really rapidly ramping up. But whilst this is going on, I think we also need to pay attention to the unintended consequences, the way in which physical climate risk reporting might lead to capital flight from the most exposed locations, the way in which the big uncertainties that still exist in the information we have about climate risks might mean that people who are actually doing a lot on the ground to adapt are not getting the credit for it in terms of the availability of finance to them. So in the end, I think this points back to a fundamental role of governments in regulating and in motivating adaptation action themselves. So I hope that that will also get the attention it deserves at COP26.
Some great points there, Jim. I can say, because DIT has been involved with the exhibition side, that the exhibition side for adaptation and mitigation solutions has been vastly oversubscribed. There's just not enough space. So it's not only difficult to get a hotel room, it's also very difficult to get space to be part of the event. But to hear the progress of some of those areas like the index and the use of spatial data is music to my ears. Certainly there'll be a significant display on spatial data because we can see so much of the Earth in real time from space today, and use that as a tool to measure and monitor the planet that we all live on. To move into solutions, though, it is a bigger challenge as to how do we actually take action quickly with the urgency needed. Perhaps I can move to Carlos Monreal, who is clearly with us from a company called Plastic Energy, and you clearly look at things from the plastics end, but you must have seen a lot more interest in reducing the plastic in society, reducing the pollution in society. Would you care to comment a little bit more about how that side is progressing? Carlos?
Yeah, I think it's the society really got very much aware on the situation of plastics before COVID. And then with COVID, it seems like everybody has been focusing on something else. And really the social media has reduced the pressure of what has to be done in terms of increasing recycling of plastics. And clearly now the countries are looking more to boost their economies. And after COVID, that is particularly important in Southeast Asia. There has been a few things happening in the last few months. Is the export of waste contaminated plastics to developing countries is going to be more restricted. That is going to help those countries to do better. Obviously, to control the leakage that currently goes to the environment because of lack of infrastructure on those 10 developing countries. However, that is going to bring the countries that we used to export, what we are going to be doing with that type of waste that previously we were just forgetting about it by exporting it to other countries. And now, theoretically, we are going to have to start to do something with that locally. And that is going to request heavy investments, policy. We have, just to make examples, in the UK, we have probably more than 300 different type of waste systems across the country. It's more than 40 different ways of managing the waste, and that is clearly is extremely challenging. There is a lot of work that is being done to improve it. There is many things to be done. Right now, it's more a question to the industry to react. The whole value chain is working on it. It doesn't matter if we are talking the brand owners like Nestle, Coca-Cola, Danone, the Unilever. They have a big commitments to incorporate recycled plastic content within their packaging to reduce the use of unnecessary plastics. So there is a lot that has been communicated from the most important users of the material, but also there is, to the surprise of everyone, even the petrochemical industry in their plans to decarbonize their industry. They are also putting big programs that they are going to implement over the next years to come in order to reduce, to our surprise, the fossil oil based feedstock that they use today to produce plastics, to the point that I will be surprised that the industry will not announce soon that they are going to recommend the authorities to incorporate probably up to 30% of the plastic that is used in packaging coming from recycling. And that will be a nice target from the industry that it will not be, that it will have to deliver, and that will request investments, and that will be the beginning of really something that is necessary to do. So I will say that the whole value chain is now working on it. Still many things to be done in terms of policy. It's very difficult to get all the different countries with unified decisions. And similar to what is happening with COP26 is, the temperature, the global temperature has risen more than 1% compared to pre-industrial times. And if we continue this way, that is going to bring us up to 4% by the end of this century. And 190 countries, they signed the Paris Agreement in 2015. And however, we are still now going into the path that probably by 2025, we are going to have 1.5 warning compared to pre-industrial levels. So if nothing changes, as we were saying before, Pilita and Ramiro, if nothing happens really soon, with the current policies, we are going to be in track to really reach 1.5 degrees by 2030, or 2 degrees by the mid-century. And that will affect more than 500 million people that will have problems on severe heat, or more than 10 million people that could be exposed to a sea level rise. So yes, we need to do something. We have a few years only ahead of us, and we really need to try to go to 2030 and cut net global CO2 emissions by at least 40-45% from 2010 levels. And then we have to act now.
Carlos, it's great to hear that industry is working on solutions, but if we're still transporting waste around the world, we should be putting a stop to that. But equally, I think the suggestions from industry that industry are working on need clear calls to action. So do this, don't do that, do this, don't do that, that sort of language. Not everybody understands all the science involved, but maybe what we should do as the British-Spanish Society is start to think about what are the top 10 things we could be doing, and see if we can put them in some sort of order. I throw that out as an idea. Maybe I can go to David Reavley just to say a few words about solar water and some of the great work you're doing around the world with trying to find water using solar power.
Thank you, Mike. I'd just like to thank everybody to date. I've learned an awful lot in the last 45 minutes. I tend to agree with Pilita that I have very little confidence in COP26, but for probably some different reasons to other people. And I'd like to thank Carlos, the last speaker. He's the only one that's used a word that I was going to use. So thank you for stealing my word, but it's a great word. That is, I don't like the word adoption. I like the word implementation. And what solar water has tried to do since our inception in 2016, after about 2.5 years of development and working very closely with academics at Cranfield University, we decided to commercialize our solution. Desalination is generally done by a process called reverse osmosis. That is burning a fossil fuel. There are 16,000 desalination plants around the world. They create 76 million tons of CO2 a year. It's forecast by 2027 that'll probably double because of the world shortage of water. We've mentioned coal, cash, cars and trees. Well, if you just take cars and trees, you can't make a car without water, and you can't grow a tree without water. So it's all about the water. So we did some research. There's 177 countries in the world that has a water problem. We can't solve 177, but further research for our process, we can attack about 70 of those countries. And at the moment, we are talking to 30 of them. I attended a number of conferences around the world to understand what the world was saying about the lack of water. I went to Madrid, I went to Abu Dhabi, I went to Muscat, I went to Manila. Everybody was saying the same thing, but not many people were doing an awful lot about it. So I decided to go like Daniel into the lion's den, I went to Saudi Arabia, the world's largest desalinator. They desalinate 23% of the world's desalinated water through 28 plants. I was going to challenge the world's biggest desalinator to change his thought process. So if I was going to be challenged, I was going to be challenged by the world's biggest. I challenged them. And I used the analogy that I did earlier on, right? And just as I was about to speak to 25 senior members of the government and NEOM and the Crown Prince, somebody delivered a bottle of water and put it on my desk. I forgot all the notes I was going to articulate, and I just picked up the bottle of water and said, for 7 millennia, we've lived without electricity. I challenge everybody in the room to live 7 days without water. So where is Saudi's priority? Is it electricity or is it water? I got a round of applause, and 6 months later, I got a contract. I then went to Jordan. I went to Jordan for another reason. Jordan are bottom of the world's water league table. They're not blessed with oil, but they are blessed with phosphate. And the largest exporter out of Jordan is Jordan Phosphate Mines Company. But they need water in an industrial process to produce more, because the raw product is turned into fertilizer, and the world needs more fertilizer for the growing population. They can't make more fertilizer because they don't have enough water. We are making JPMC, Jordan Phosphate Mines Company, independent of water from their local community. We're building a plant in their plant, and we will be creating 6 million cubic meters of water for them using the power of the sun, right? So our technology is harnessing concentrated solar power to desalinate seawater. There's a few things that you have to take into account: the salinity of the sea, the ambient temperature during sunlight hours, the number of sunlight hours. But like I was saying, we think we can part solve the problem in 80 countries in the world. And so far, we've got 2 contracts in Jordan and Saudi, and we're talking to another 30 other countries, which include Chile, Mexico, Egypt, Morocco, India, Pakistan, Australia, the state of California, the state of Nevada, the state of Texas, right? So it's not just some of the obvious countries that are short of water, and they're short of water for a whole host of reasons. Irrigation for growing food, industrialization, increased population, healthcare. COVID-19 has focused everybody. We've had adverts: wash your hands as frequently as possible. Great if you live in the Northern Hemisphere. I can wash my hands 50, 60, 70, 100 times a day. But what if I live in the Middle East or in another country where I'm one of the 1 billion people on the planet that don't have access to fresh water? What about the 4,100 children that die every day because of lack of water? So it's about the implementation. It's not about the adopting of it. Let's keep talking about it. It's about having a solution, innovation. We innovated for 2.5 years. We've commercialized for another 18 months, and we're now seeing some success. I applaud the DIT out of Whitehall in London, the support that they have given us, not only out of London, but around the world, has been a significant factor in our success. I hope COP26 can bring something about, but not another talking shop, and let's have another COP27. I attended the 14th annual conference of clean energy in Manila, and I challenged the room: why will there be a 15th annual conference? I asked the room, how many people in the room are in the construction industry? About a third put their hand up. How many people in the room are from the banking sector? Another third put their hand up. How many people are academics? Another third put their hand up. Right then. So we know what we have to do. There's a room full of people who can do it. So let's implement it and let's do it. But no, we'll have another conference. And somebody just asked a question a few minutes ago. And I suppose all these 20,000 people are flying to Glasgow. It's just a contradictory of terms, right? I don't understand why it needs 20,000 people to attend, right? I don't know why, right? We have to have a total rethink. And the people that have enjoyed this evening with, you've taught me an awful lot, and you've given me some other insights that I hope I'll be able to deploy with my team to implement things, because it's not too strong a word. It is a crisis, right? Water is a crisis in 177 countries, and it's been affected by climate change. And I'll just repeat, desalination at the moment creates 76 million tons of CO2. I'm trying to implement something to reduce that. Thank you.
David, that's great. And I know you've had some interest from Spain as well as those other countries you listed. So it's great you've explained it more clearly to this audience. I'd like to go to some questions from the floor now, if I may. Some of the questions have been put in the chat. Maybe I can start at the top and I'll take more questions as they arise. Anna, at the beginning, you briefly referred to carbon trading. And clearly, there are some issues around both carbon leakage and also carbon offsets. How would you comment on that sort of area? How important is that for the COP26 talks, would you say, Anna?
Okay, I think at least at the EU, the carbon trading system has proved to work, because thanks to that, we have reduced emissions in the last 10 years of its existence. And therefore, now one of the topics that are on the table in COP26, as I said previously, is Article 6. So if there are possibilities and there is a final agreement on this, on how to extend carbon trading systems all over the world, then I think that it can make a difference. It can help to mitigate climate change, which is one of the objectives, and also will help to not to increase the global temperature, as the Article 2.1 of the Paris Agreement states. And on carbon offsetting and of course how to reach net zero, I think it's fundamental to preserve biodiversity. Before, I saw also in the chat someone that was mentioning oceans. Oceans also plays an essential role as a carbon sink, and therefore ecosystems and habitats as mangroves and wetlands, rivers are fundamental to preserve, and as well as the other ecosystems or oceans or ecosystems. On the table, I mean, in COP26, not all these topics are being addressed, but for example, this year it has to be cancelled again. Another COP of the biodiversity COP that was to take place in China last year, that was cancelled, and it was to take place this year in October. Now there are a new framework for new commitments is being developed, is being negotiated. So I think that it's also very important, the complementarity of multilateral environmental agreements and of the Rio Conventions as the biodiversity and UNFCCC. So this is what I can comment. But I have also seen a question regarding carbon trading at the EU level. So I don't know if you want me to answer that question.
You can cover that briefly, that'd be great.
Yes, okay. The question is about Fit for 55 and also about the carbon border adjustment mechanism proposed by the European Commission and the emissions trading scheme that it's proposed to be extended to other sectors as transport and buildings. And I think first that let's see what happens in the negotiating procedure, in the legislative procedure of the EU, because now this is proposals by the EU, and as everybody knows, there are different sensibilities at the EU countries. For example, Pilita mentioned before the need to phase out coal, and as you know, Poland has been one of the countries that has been resisting to this. So let's see what happens in the negotiation. There are many pieces of legislation proposed, so I'm sure some of the proposals will go quickly, but some others will be more difficult to negotiate. For example, with the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, also it has to be in line with the trade organization rules. And this is something that it's on the table, and we will see what happens. And on the emission trading scheme for the building and the transport sector, the European Commission is proposing to implement this new scheme to the fuels producers, not to the owners of buildings or apartments or to the owners of cars, because this can create a big problem of just transition and inequity. And this is linked to the other question in this that was posed by Ben Welch, that speaks about whether there is political will to move towards energy independence. And I think that it's fundamental, energy independence, because these days we are witnessing how the energy tariff, and the energy invoice that consumers we are paying at the EU countries, it's increasing and increasing because of the increase of prices of gas these days in the international market, and also of coal. For example, in South European countries as Spain is nowadays the country with the highest electricity bill. Like the prices in the auctions, in the daily auctions on energy is rising. Some days, today was the highest price was 140 euros a megabyte. So it's really very, very expensive, and for consumers, this we have also problems at the EU level of energy poverty. Therefore, energy independence is key for fighting energy poverty. So I hope to have answered the questions of those that
You've answered several in one, and that's great. Moving on to Pilita. Pilita, Jim Hall, your fellow panelist, has said, I'm curious to know from Pilita what an ambitious yet realistic ask should be from China, and what the USA would have to do to land China in a deal at COP26. He specifically says what the USA would have to do to land China in a deal at COP26. Would you care to have a go at that? And maybe also talk a little bit more about the urgency of innovation.
I think that, unfortunately, the message that is coming out of Beijing for Washington at the moment, anyway, is that if you want us to do much more on climate change, you've got to leave the Uyghurs alone, and you've got to get out of our hair in the South China Sea, and you've got to basically stop interfering with what China sees as its sovereign rights. And I think the problem for the Biden administration is that it's John Kerry is making a valiant effort to say, look, we can park our differences, our economic and our strategic and our defense differences. We can leave them to one side. And the climate imperative is so demanding that we can just work together on that. At the moment, China is saying, no, not. I mean, that's the message that we're getting. And, you know, it is September. The economic relationship between the two is obviously so much more fraught than it was in the lead up to Paris, that it's just difficult to see how you know, it's difficult to know how much of that is rhetoric that could turn around. But anyway, what I think Washington, I don't know what Washington is asking, but as a first step, you know, China has done something that very few people expected it to do. You know, it has, as you know, Jim, it's announced that it is going to become carbon neutral by 2060, which is more than some countries, including my native Australia, have done. It has actually set a long-term net zero carbon neutral target. That's great. 2060 is far too late. So I would say that as a first step, Washington should be saying, we'd like that 2060 to come down a bit, thanks. But in the secondly, we need to see much more action by 2030. The whole world understands now that carbon emissions have to effectively halve, as Carlos spelled out earlier, by 2030 if we're to keep to safe temperature limits. China is such an enormous emitter that doesn't happen without China. So the third ask, I would say, is that China needs to spell out when it's going to phase out coal. It's the world's biggest coal user. It burns more, you know, burns a phenomenal amount of coal. It's not showing, it needs to phase it out domestically. It needs to stop funding it in Belt and Road projects. In other words, it needs to do what a number of countries have done and said, basically, we're not going to fund coal projects abroad. So those would be the three big things I think Washington should be asking for. I'd like, you know, it'd be terrific if what we're seeing at the moment is just shadow dancing, and in fact there is real movement in Beijing, but thus far we haven't seen it.
And Pilita, would you try the supplementary question, which is, you know, the urgency of the innovation? What are you seeing the same sector-led initiatives from industry that might bring about the innovation we may need, perhaps to help, despite it being not urgent enough?
I think we've seen tremendous innovation. I mean, you know, it's just astonishing the rate at which the price of renewable energy has dropped, or renewable energy generation has dropped in the last, you know, since I became environment correspondent in 2011. It was inconceivable back then that solar power and wind power would ever be able to compete against coal, let alone, you know, gas in electricity generation. That's happened all around the world now. It is literally cheaper to build very large solar and wind power generating projects rather than to build a lot of coal or gas-fired power stations. You know, that's quite astonishing. And I don't think, you know, people didn't expect the price to drop, the costs to drop as dramatically as they have. So I think there has been tremendous innovation. And I don't, you know, I'm not, that to me is not a concern. I think, for the reasons that Carlos mentioned and others have mentioned, you know, we're seeing tremendous drive in industry to innovate, and you know, David and Carlos are great examples of that. I think, you know, the wave of money we've seen come in from investors who are keen to be doing as much as possible to advance climate action is not going to stop, in my view. It's not going to go away. And so I'm not concerned about that. But what I am concerned about is just at the national political level, we're not seeing significant enough movement in Beijing, but not Beijing alone, in India, in Russia, even in Tokyo, and certainly in places like Australia, which could do an enormous amount better. We're just not seeing the national political framework be as flexible and adept and as it should be when it comes to meeting this enormous challenge.
But without blaming one country, I think it's very important to report on progress, even if the urgency on the political level may not be strong enough at the moment. Some of that innovation example areas such as carbon capture and storage, some of the areas to do with innovation finance or even renewables, I think is a good story in itself. We still need to do more, but putting that in context is important. I think you may have frozen, Pilita, so I'm going to go on to Jim briefly. Jim, you posed the question. Was that answered well enough for you?
Yeah, thanks very much indeed, Pilita. That was really interesting, actually. I think we're all trying to kind of get some sense of what a deal looks like, and this question in China as to what extent we can persuade each other that we have a shared interest in climate change whilst being economic rivals and having security and human rights differences has somehow very much become the center of this.
Well, I think we're only on one planet and we share it together. So we have to find ways of sharing it together. And issues of adaptation and mitigation will come with innovation, I would have thought. So sharing that innovation that doesn't stop at the border is part of this story. Can you talk a little bit more about weather events and whether we're talking enough about monitoring of weather events, particularly which may arise from the changes to the climate or the planet?
Yeah, well, I think the IPCC assessment report was pretty striking in that sense, in terms of the both the extent to which the scientists were able to say with certainty that climate change is attributable to greenhouse gas emissions, but also the incredible scientific steps which have been taken with respect to attribution of specific weather events. I think we all understand now that even though one can't definitively attribute any weather event to climate change, we can say how much climate change has changed the odds of those weather events occurring. And the extent to which climate change is changing the odds then differs from event to event. But warming the oceans means that hurricanes have more energy in them. A warmer atmosphere is able to contain more water and is resulting in much larger convective downpours. A warmer temperature is increasing evapotranspiration, even if we're not completely sure overall on exactly what the trends in rainfall are going to be. But that is making a lot of parts of the world more arid. So the science is coming increasingly clear there. And I think the politicians, communicators are getting better at using the right words around that. And I think that is having a difference. There's been a fair bit of comment in the chat here about public perceptions and public action, about alarmism. I think we can talk in very realistic ways about the effect that climate change is having on extreme events. And I mean, I think that's being reflected in levels of public action and public concern. And in response to one of the questions in the chat, I think that public action is absolutely instrumental in political change. We've seen climate strikes and Fridays for climate, and that has not gone unnoticed. So I think that action, I mean, politicians are looking for the political space to make bold actions, and what's been going on by the public is providing them with more space. You're on mute, Mike.
Mute difficulties. About 10 minutes to go, so I'm just going to ask one wrap-up question to all of you, and it's the same question for each of you. And I'm going to pose this to Ramiro first, followed by Carlos and David, and then take the final three after that. So my single question is, if you had a magic wand and a wish to really speed up implementation towards meeting climate change targets, mitigating disaster, and really adapting the planet, what would that one wish be applied to? And I'm asking Ramiro to give his one wish first, followed by Carlos, followed by David. Ramiro?
Maybe if I would have to focus on just one measure there to ensure this is to halve emission by 2030, I would definitely ensure to have all the finance sector community setting up their metrical systems in place to shift current investments on the fossil fuel industry into the transition that we will need on energy and regeneration of nature-based solutions. To me, this is the pivoting role. Yeah.
Financial alignment. What about you, Carlos?
I would say that is I will focus in three, but I'm going to choose one. I will really say we have to redefine the use and the way that we produce energy. But I'm sure that David is going to talk about that later. And we have to change the way that we manage our land. And really, I'm going to focus myself because of my specialty in the way that we make and consume goods and services. I want to give some good examples of the value chain. This is, I think now we are ending the summer. Is that you could see, if you like ice cream, let's say the Magnum ice cream pot is made out of recycled plastic coming from our plants. Same thing with the North soup or the Philadelphia cheese packaging. Or let's go to the consumer area, like the clean skincare of or Tupperware, or the Bradbury cheese commercialized in the UK by Tesco. So we have good examples that we have been able to really change the way that we produce products, reducing fossil oil consumption to produce plastics and being able to use them in the packaging that we normally consume. And there are many things to be done. As a company, we have been, let's say, putting a strategy to reduce our travels. As one of the people in the audience raised it, and that is going to be important. It's not because of COVID, it's because we have learned a new way of working. So I think there are many things to be done.
Rethinking consumption, perhaps packaging, perhaps travel.
Yes.
David.
It sounds like a very easy question, and you promised easy questions, Mike. But it's quite a difficult question. But I would go to collaboration. The global pandemic produced a great deal of collaboration. And we got vaccines, which normally take 10 years. We got them in 10 months. So the world can collaborate when there's a crisis, right? So I would just like politicians to start collaborating, and all these targets that they issue, 2030, 2027, 2050, 20 whatever, they know they won't be around in those dates. So it doesn't matter to them what date they put, because they won't be there to take the flak. So let's all agree that the world has a problem. So let's all collaborate, magic wand, and say, right, COP26, there's 20,000 people there. Let's all leave with this mission and vision to collaborate and solve the problem. And it's not about ego, and it's not about this, it's about solving the problem. But that's my, if I had the magic wand, that's what I'd wave over Glasgow in November.
Great. Anna?
Yes, I agree. It's a very difficult question because we are talking about a very complex problem with many angles. But I think that it's key. My wish would be that there is really a good framework for finance, for climate finance for developing countries, and that it's agreed in the COP26. And also there is technology transfer and capacity building, because all that we are today, we are from the north and I assume Western countries. And the climate change is a universal problem. And there are many people in this planet that they don't have resources, they don't have any idea what they can do. They don't understand even the problem, but they suffer the problem. So therefore we have, my wish is to focus on support to the developing world, more support for it.
That's great. Pilita?
Okay, here's my wish, that that the world would listen to the International Energy Agency which is not a body that has always been associated with fervent climate action, but did this year say that actually there could be no new fossil fuel developments if net zero targets were to be met by the middle of the century, as we know they need to be. And unfortunately, in the UK alone, in the run-up to COP, we're seeing a Scottish oil field development still very much under discussion in Cambo. In other words, that message hasn't really sunk in yet. So if there were a magic wand and I were wielding it, that would be my wish, that extremely difficult but very important edict, or not edict, but suggestion from the IEA were heeded.
That would need to be a pretty mighty wand, but I take the way in which you've answered the question very positively. And lastly, I think it's Jim.
Yeah, thank you. Well, like Pilita, I've been incredibly impressed and encouraged by what has gone on through competitive mechanisms in the energy markets, through energy auctions, driving down prices in a remarkable way. So what I'd like to see is those really challenging regulatory and competitive frameworks which give the certainty for the future, so the innovators know what's coming and know that if they innovate, they can compete, they can win, and they can solve this problem.
That's really cool. And that's a good note to end on. Thanks very much. I'd like to thank all the panelists today. Just a brief thank you from me, and then I'm going to hand to our chairman, Jimmy Burns. But a great thank you to all of you for sharing all of your insights and knowledge. I think we've learned so much in an hour and a half. It's just gone in a flash. But I think we've exchanged knowledge and we've had it in a very balanced way. I'm not sure we're going to fix everything to do with COP26, but so long as we see continuous improvement in the run-up to COP26 and beyond, I think we need to concentrate on things like implementation and adaptation and mitigation, and less to do with the pure climate science. That's a personal view. I'd also like to thank my colleagues, Brett Theobald, who's been in touch with all of you, and indeed Justin Ellis, who's been behind the scenes, and my other colleagues at the British Spanish Society for putting on this particular event. So a big thank you to you all. May I, on that note, just hand to you, Jimmy Burns, just to say a few words on behalf of the British Spanish Society.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. It's been a long session and absolutely fascinating. I wanted just to reiterate on behalf of my colleagues, my thanks to all the panelists. They've been absolutely amazing. And a particular word of thanks to Mike for chairing this in such an expert way, and to Brett, who put a hell of a lot of effort into helping organize this, and to Justin, as usual, holding it together. I just really wanted to end with, and also thank you to Soda Water and Plastic Energy for helping support us, which just leads me to remind you that we're often accused of being a small charity that punches above its weight. I mean, this is an example of simply because people take us seriously that we can gather this kind of panel. But just to remind you, we are all absolute volunteers, including myself, Mike, and an excellent team that puts all this together. And one of the things we do is we support postgraduate innovation, creativity, and research across from fields from medical research, environment, right through to the arts. And I simply want to leave you with that, because, you know, if we're talking about how the world's going to change, it's going to be the youth that's going to change it, and we're investing in that as a charity. So keep looking at our website, see what we're doing, and spread the word about, you know, we're worth it, you know, and we are a punto de encuentro, which can gather a panel that goes from Patagonia tonight right through to Madrid, on to London and beyond. And it's an example of to pick up of what one of the panelists said, the need for cooperation. And we're only going to solve this as cooperation. I really hope that's the way we go. I mean, one of the questions I asked was about Pope Francis, because I'm his biographer. Pope Francis has a very good word, which is the need to not lose sight of the periphery. And Anna referred to this. At the end of the day, if COP26 does not address the poverty issue, the need of the developing world, and how we need to transfer resources in a big way, it will be a huge failure. I'm an optimist by heart. I don't think it will be. But thank you very, very much. Muchísimas gracias a los españoles. Thank you very much a los ingleses. And Pilita, thank you for being a global star. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everybody. All the best and good night for the proceedings.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.